Sting is actually in the Hall of Fame, but there were a lot of people that were against Sting going into the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame.
It took
Why the hell
years.
is that? Yeah, why did it take so long? And what did they have against the guy? Because as a guy, I was a kid in the '90s, so I grew up with Sting, so I always saw him as being one of the top guys in the country his whole career. So I didn't see what people held against the guy. What was
What
the
they
story
had
behind that?
against him was, at the time, the supposed credentials to get in a Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. You're talking 20 years ago. Was he the top draw at the time in the company, in his company or territory or the world? Was he the top wrestler, athlete? And yeah, you would look at the numbers, and they was always heavily against Sting. And when people would talk about it, because they were like, "Oh, well, he was the post Crockett era," and you got to remember, this is one thing I disagree heavily with Dave on. Like, he has really bashed Dusty Rhodes, and this is something I know Cody's had an issue with him on. Talking about Rhodes's booking and his issues and things like that, and it was just like, you look at that Crockett stuff now. I mean, it looks spectacular. It's still watchable. Find anything in the '80s from WWF that looks you can watch and is watchable. There's nothing. It is goofy garbage, and there's some diamonds in it, but Crockett is very much. I mean, people watch Ric Flair videos to this day. People watch Dusty. I mean, there's Instagram accounts, to all those wrestlers, and just the interviews they would do. And Sting just, so he was like part of that disrespect. And I think it carried on to Sting because, he wasn't even like the top. He wasn't even among the Crockett top guys. He was in this kind of wedge area where he was the top guy because Flair wasn't there. And then it was just always an excuse for it. I think a lot of it was just WWE bias because he was the top babyface in all of wrestling in '96 and '97. And that was when Austin was on top in WWE. Austin became a bigger name in '98, but at the same time, I mean, he didn't have Hulk Hogan sabotaging him. He also didn't have a company that was building him up and an owner that believed in him, or had to put all their chips on him. Like, Vince had to put all his chips on Austin. He had to do that. He had a guy coming up, the same time as him, like Rock. Sting was a top draw. He was also the top draw in WCW for a good 10 years during a period when they had some amazing stuff, like him and the Jake Roberts angle and Rick Rude and things like that, and different matches. I mean, the great stuff he had with Ric Flair up until, he went into the Crow gimmick. And it was like, this is the hottest babyface draw in wrestling during the period when it was the hottest time in the business ever in the United States. And it was amazing to me how people overlooked that. It's like, even if he was number 2, he should still be in like the Hall of Fame. It's like, what is it? I couldn't figure, people always found ways to discount what he did. And I never knew it. I think a lot of it was because he never went to WWE. He wasn't a guy who jumped over, went 2002, 2003. And Booker T will crap on him about this, but at the time he didn't, but it was like, he saw how Vince treated those guys. He knew how Vince operated, and he didn't want to go over because he didn't want to be around that. He'd spent a lot of his life, especially in the late '90s and early 2000s, really getting his life back together. He got away from a lot of the issues he was having to deal with, that wrestlers were dealing with. He got involved in church, and he was just, he definitely made the right decision. Because the guy's at 64 and he looks incredible.
Yes.
Look at him versus Triple H. Triple H is 13 years younger than him. It amazes me that people that think that, and most people would consider Triple H to be a bigger part of wrestling than Sting, which is ridiculous. That's not even an argument. I mean, I think, if you ask the average fan, I bet you they would say that. And to me, it's just, it's brain dead. Because like, if you went on social media, the so-called internet wrestling community, which I don't think really exists, it's just a cesspool, but you go on there and you ask people, well, Triple H, who was better, who was a bigger star, Triple H or Sting? I mean, I know that most of them would say Triple H, but that's nowhere near true. I mean, Sting was a top guy in a company for 10 years, and a part of it was the biggest company in the world. It's to me, it's just, I think a lot of it's just, the internet was very, very WWE friendly when it came up. You also had the fact that, there was some bias, I think, against some of the territories, especially in the South, because a lot of the newsletter readers tended to be in the coastal areas, in the more WWE areas. And the internet came out that way too when it started. It started more as up Northeast where a lot of the money was. And I think that all played into him just being discounted. And all I got to say is, if you believe that, we just go back and watch Survivor Series when he walked out. I mean, that led ESPN.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me that guy's not a legend in the Hall of Fame. You can't.
No. And then his intro into AEW, everything he's done there has been gold. It's been incredible.
I'll tell you what, Tony Khan don't get enough credit for is there's guys like him that he is just used so perfectly.
Yep.
He's
done a, and that's why I had to go at JD. I had to get in JD's face a little bit when he said that Sting was 64. I said, no, Steve Borden is 64. Sting is immortal, sir.
Fair.
One thing's a superhero.
Oh, yes. So one thing I always thought was interesting. Oh, sorry, BJ, go. You're the guest.
I mean, the things he's doing physically is incredible, but it shows what you do if you take care of yourself. This is a guy who, he got his body and his things right at the right amount at the right time when a lot of people in the business didn't. And look at what he's doing. And this isn't a guy who hasn't been without injuries. I mean, he still had, one of the most devastating knee injuries ever in 90. This was a guy who was doing, Japanese style high flying planches off the top rope onto the floor, in 89 and 90. I'll always say this is like people will discount him. Flair has said this repeatedly. Sting would have been the biggest star of the 80s, and he'll still say this today. He thinks Sting was better than Hogan. And he said if Sting would have been around in 83, Hulkamania would have never been anything. No one would be even talking about it. And Flair and Hogan are pretty close. Hogan's put Flair over a lot in the last few years. And, that coming from Flair says a lot to me. This tells you how much they think of Sting as, as a person and as a draw and as a worker. And, and to me, it's a shame that, for so many years, I'm so glad he's gotten this way to go out on his own because, WWE didn't do him right. And, and he really kind of carried TNA through some ridiculous stuff and some great stuff too. Let's not discount some of the amazing stuff they had in TNA. But I'm glad he's had this run. It's just been so fun to watch, so incredible. And, I'm glad to see him and Dustin Rhodes doing what they're doing there. It's great. It's been great to watch. It's been one of the few things that, I've gotten a lot of joy out of the business.
JD, you had something?
One thing I was always going to say about Sting is that I think what's made him so great is how he's always overcome bad booking. Bad booking torpedoes a lot of careers before it starts. And Sting, I'd argue, never had a lot of good booking. The moment he became champion the first time around in 90, they had no idea what to do with him. They concocted this Black Scorpion ridiculousness. And you can't even blame Dusty for that because he was wearing polka dots in New York. That's Ole's brainchild. He had no idea what it was going to be. Should have been Eddie Gilbert. But it was like, by the time they got there, it was Flair. What the fuck? And then the next time around, he survived 5 different bookers, 6, 7 different, in the 10 years he was there, he had 7 different bookers in WCW, and not one of them thought one thing alike, but the one constant there was Sting was over. Imagine if he ever had competent booking. Even when he got to WWE, the booking was terrible. He was right. Everything that Sting thought Vince would do to him happened.
Yeah.
It happened.
They did everything they could to murder his mystique. And they couldn't do it. They got the NWO involved in his match, and that was the other thing was like, I remember to this day they try to talk about how he looked out of shape in 1997 when he was like, 32 years old or whatever. It's like, you see the guy's 64 and still wrestling, and you're trying to tell me he couldn't go when he was in his 30s.
What Sting reminds me of is that number 1 overall draft pick in the NFL that gets drafted to a bad team, and every year he plays well, but he's got bad head coaches and bad offensive coordinators, and they keep failing, and the team never gets to the Super Bowl. And then finally, last couple of years, he's like John Elway. Last couple of years of his career, you know what I mean? All of a sudden, he gets with the right mix. He gets Tony Khan, or John Elway had Mike Shanahan, and then finally was able to get his just due in the twilight of his career.
That is such a big comparison.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah. Yeah.